Gotta love that chutzpah. That's why she's here. That's why we're all here. We love chutzpah. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Oh, losing my notes, which were very helpfully printed out landscape. Thanks, Hotel, for that. Anyway, here we are. Welcome to these wonderful, wonderful women and to all of you. I mean, I feel like I don't need to introduce both of these women because that's why you're here, but I will anyway because their CVs are so impressive. First of all, Amy Wallace is a writer whose work has appeared in publications including The New Yorker, Esquire, Vanity Fair, New York Times Magazine. She's a former Los Angeles Times and Atlanta Journal-Constitution staff reporter, and her work has varied from political reporting to spending 2 years covering prisons and death row. Amy has also collaborated on best-selling books, and of course the reason we're all here is this one. It's an incredible, extraordinary book co-authored with the late Virginia Giuffre. And I've found it an incredibly moving process reading it. It's all the more so heartbreaking because after fighting for so many years, Virginia suicided last year. And one of the things that's really clear from this book is the trauma-informed care that Amy has taken in collaborating with a subject whose story is a shocking indictment on the Times. And as a journalist who knows how to peer behind the curtain, Amy's kindness to Virginia shines through these pages. Please welcome Amy Wallace. And of course, Emily Maitlis is a former BBC journalist and presenter of the Newsnight program, now presenter of the excellent Newsagents US podcast, which is part of
Thank you.
part of my regular news listening diet to keep up with the mad cycle of American politics, as I'm sure it is for many of you. I'm sure she's been told this before, but Emily has one of the most distinctive and excellent voices in the business. Honestly, I could be soothed to sleep by it every night.
It's not quite what I intended. Like, on a good day.
It's okay. So that's the kind of crazy lady I am. Emily is also what we could describe as a giant slayer. The woman who, with the scoop of the century, brought down the artist formerly known as Prince Andrew. And now, thanks to the work of Emily and indeed the bravery of Virginia Giuffre, simply Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor. In that car crash of an interview, not for Emily, mind you, she was awesome, Emily made famous a certain Pizza Express in Woking and the idea that some people just don't sweat. Who knew? She was the executive producer of the TV series A Very Royal Scandal, and she was played very effectively by Ruth Wilson, which I must have been such a spin out, and I'll get to that, having someone play you. But please welcome Emily Maitlis.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, just some very quick housekeeping. You can ask questions at the end of the presentation, but you need to do so through Slido. Go to slido.com and you can type in the event code behind us here to ask a question. And there is a legal requirement that is being put down by me that you are not allowed to make a statement. You have to ask a question. If I see a statement, I won't pick it. So I'll weed them out, you've been told. Now, I want to pause for a minute here because while we three are here to speak about this topic, Virginia Giuffre and at least one other Epstein victim is not with us. And I want everyone here to pause and have a thought for Virginia and Caroline and for all victims of sexual crimes when they were children or young people in particular, and how that fundamentally changes them at a developmentally critical age. And I feel deeply moved and angered and even shocked reading Virginia's memoir. So please, it seems odd and sad and weird, but please give a round of applause for that incredible woman who deserved better. And on that note, Amy, one of the things that, we often do is call people who have been victims of child sexual abuse survivors. But Virginia wasn't a survivor ultimately. She was for a very, very long time. But ultimately, she gave up the fight. How was that for you, and why do you think that finally happened?
Well, it was devastating. Obviously, we'd worked together for more than 4 years on the book, and I'd come to Perth twice and lived with her family for about a month in their guest room. We'd talked hundreds of times in Zoom and FaceTime at all hours of the day and night. And yes, she and the other victims of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell call themselves survivor sisters, and survival was the key. So of course it was devastating that she ultimately committed suicide. Those of you who have read the book know that she tried to kill herself while we were working on the book, back to back twice, after a particularly devastating deposition that she was asked to give with a particularly devastating person who I can't name. But she'd always been resilient. She'd always bounced back. The minute she got back out of the hospital after that attempt, she called me and she said, "We're putting that in the book." And I said, "Okay, are you sure?" And she said, "Yes, because I need other victims of sexual abuse, anyone, male, female, who's been coerced into a sexual situation that they don't want to be in, to know that I still struggle with it, that they are not alone in their shame." So this is a very brave person who was willing to show herself, warts and all, to help us, to help the rest of us. So the fact that she lost that battle was horrifying. And, of course, no one person can be inside the brain of someone else. I had talked to her very, very recently before she killed herself, but I know that she was struggling with a lot of different things. But she describes in the book the voice that would come to her, and this is the voice of what that you hear when you feel worthless, that says the world would be a better place without you in it. And that's a thing that happens when you've been traumatized repeatedly from the age of 7. So it's just such a loss for all of us, and I wish she was sitting here right now.
Mm. What would she want everyone here to know?
I think she would want everyone to know that your own individual outrage matters, and that it can make a difference. We all feel like, well, what can I do? What can I do? The world is a terrible place. Now we know how terrible from these Epstein Files. We know particularly about this sex trafficking ring. But remember, Virginia is a woman who was abused from the age of 7 on, who did not graduate from high school, who was not wealthy. And she decided at one point, after she'd had a daughter, her 3rd child, that she was going to make the world a better place. And she did. And I do think that as sad as her ultimate end is and was, she's an inspiring, heroic person. She just decided to make things better. And I'm inspired by that every day. I think that's incredible, to just make that decision when you don't have a lot of resources. And she did it at her own expense, again and again and again. So I think in this time that we live in this country that I live in, which is run by an administration that is shameful, our outrage matters. And speaking up matters individually, in groups, get together, state your beliefs loud and clear. And I do believe that is partly why King Charles finally said something and said not just a vague statement, but said, we will support a police investigation into my own brother. Why did he say that? He could have done it 15 years ago. Because the British people spoke up and they said, we are not good with this monarchy thing if it supports criminals who rape our children and don't pay the price. And things changed. And Emily will be a better spokesman on exactly how much they've changed, but I do credit the British people with that. And I think we should all learn from that and not feel weak and not feel cowed by how the bad guys often win.
On the question of the bad guys, I put up a picture of the three of us last night on Instagram, and one woman jokingly called us a monstrous regiment of women, which is it's from a book title from 1558 by John Knox talking about Mary of Guise, but the book title was The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. And look, as much as that's an amusing collective noun, it's also, there's this idea that women who hold truth to power or expose, terrible things are bad or monstrous or dangerous or difficult. We all know about difficult women in Australia. And sometimes this comes back to bite those women. And I just wondered with you, Emily, what has been the impact of what you did? Have you received blowback from certain quarters? How did it all pan out after the interview, which we're about to come to?
Honestly, no.
That's great.
No. And I think the interview worked because it carried Virginia's voice through it. It wasn't something that I went out to kind of accuse or state, or this wasn't me imposing my thoughts about what he should or shouldn't have done. This was me literally transposing the words that Virginia had given us, the allegations that she had made, the claims that she had laid out. She'd made my job very easy because she was so specific, she was so detailed, she was so forensic, she knew what had happened. And the difficult blowback for me, if I'm honest, was when at the beginning people had started, we're all aware of it, aren't we? The kind of questions that came about Virginia, like, but didn't she take money? But wasn't she there because she wanted to? But isn't 17 above the legal age? And you're kind of like, okay, let's start at the beginning. If you're trafficked, you do not get to choose. If you're underage, you do not get to choose. If you're a child, it's not prostitution, it's rape. Okay, let's set out what we're actually talking about here, and then we can go on. And Amy and I were discussing earlier, there was a moment where she changed her account of what happened to her at the hands of one person who we now know had been an immense bully to her. And after that happened, yes, I started getting blowback. I started getting people saying, oh, are you sure about that? Are you sure? And I was dead sure in my mind. And actually, the fact that those questions are being asked tells me we have a long way still to go. Because, Andrew was one. Virginia was one. There are probably 1,000 other victims out there, maybe more, and there is probably 36 at least perpetrators out there, maybe more. And so I sort of think this is the place that the conversation begins, not the place that it ends. I think that's really important.
I mean, one of the things that a lot of people out there who don't deal with victims of sexual crimes, particularly when they were children, a lot, is that trauma does curious things to memory, and they often do change their story but they remember the main thing. It's like, well, you know, what color underwear was he wearing? What part of the room was it in? I don't remember, but I was raped. I remember that.
This was why I found, I mean, I have to say, Amy's book was so helpful because I had been carrying a set, you know, from the interview, a set of what I'd understood made up of the statements that we could get hold of, the interviews that she'd given, the appearances she'd done, the words she'd said outside court. And then your and Virginia's book filled in all the details and the specifics of what a traumatized mind remembers, Louise, exactly right, tells you that there is something going on here. You know, there is something going on when you can say, I remember that because he put me in another room and he made me wait for 20 minutes until he was ready to have me. I remember that because his pregnant wife was in the next door room and she was, you know, a month away from giving birth. And the fact that you had consolidated from data, from conversations, and frankly, from FBI testaments that had been given 20 years earlier. It wasn't like it was coming to you even for the first time, some of the actual facts. It was all there. It's still there. We're able to read it now. The names are all there. And her story actually did not change.
Well, and
Not in a significant way.
well, I think particularly what you're referring to, I think, is when she said, I may have made a mistake. And she settled
Yes.
with a particular person. And that then opened up for me as well, because we were working on the book still. And well, wait a minute. If she may have made a mistake then,
Did she?
is she making all of it up? That took out of context what she was going through at the time she decided to settle that legal matter. But I will say this, and we've talked about this a little bit in terms of how trauma affects memory, and you've done so much amazing reporting around that as well. Virginia's memory was incredible, and I know this because my job was not just to be her empathetic partner and listen, interview, tape, transcribe, assert the outlines of the story, but then my job, because I was an investigative reporter, was to corroborate, because we knew from the very beginning that she was very much in danger, physical danger and legal danger. She'd been threatened, you know, take our names out of your mouth, you put us in a deposition, you may never say our names again. She had been threatened, and so we couldn't make a mistake. And so in addition to talking to her, I then double-checked. I had a huge bulletin board on my wall that had all 26 months of her being in the orbit of Epstein and Maxwell. Every single day was there, every flight log, so I knew where everybody was, what city they were in. If Ghislaine Maxwell had had her picture taken, which she often did because she often liked to go out to society parties and Getty Images, I had those images. I knew where she was at every moment. Every single bit of data, and then a lot of reporting around her with people who knew her contemporaneous to her childhood abuse, contemporaneous to her Epstein abuse and Maxwell abuse. So I then was, you know, bulletproofing and wondering, am I going to find some of this is not quite right, because trauma does such horrible things to to people's memory often. And I've got to say, I didn't find things like that. What I did find, I was describing to you the other night, what happens in a traumatized mind is you splinter. It's too much to hold the whole rape, maybe, in your mind in one place. So you take a part of it that's maybe the worst part, and you put it elsewhere. And so what that meant in our process was that she would tell me a linear story about the first 2 weeks of Epstein and Maxwell being in their orbit. And then 3 months later, she would tell me, oh, and I told you already. Then Epstein showed me that picture of my little brother and told me, basically, he was going to hurt him. He knew where he went to school. It was clearly a picture taken of him at middle school with his little backpack. And I told you this already. And I was like, well, no, but tell me now. And it was my job to then go, wow, okay, we need to put that in the first 2 weeks of her time with these people, and that does so much to explain why she stayed, because she was being threatened with the death of her little brother, her beloved little brother. And if I had been telling you that story, I would have put that in to show you, that's why I stayed. But she had segmented that off because more than her own rape, The thought of something happening to Skye was the most painful thing she could possibly imagine, and she'd sequestered that somewhere else in her brain. And it was only through developing a relationship of trust and continuing to talk that I could then assemble it in the right order.
And this is why police departments, good police departments now, their sexual crimes units actually do police statements with victims over a period of time and allow them to come back and forth, because it's just too overwhelming to be able to lay it all out in one go. And typically, they will leave things out that they sort of later need to come back and correct. And that ends up, they end up being demolished under cross-examination. I wanted to ask you, Emily, what was the sort of visceral feeling in the solar plexus that you had when you found out that Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor had been arrested?
It was a very strange one for me, actually. I think I was the last person in the United Kingdom to find out, because I'd broken my golden rule, which is, the mornings are always editorial. From the moment I wake up at 6 until I record, I sort of have my eye on the news. And I'd gone for a physio, and I'd been sort of like on the table, sort of strewn, having my left buttock massaged at the moment when he was actually being arrested. And so I emerged blinking into the sunlight and just opened my phone, which exploded in my face, and with sort of, 700 messages saying, where are you, why aren't you here, can you be on air, can you do this, can you do it, can you give us a response, can you do this? And I just sort of sat looking at it thinking, I'm not sure I understand. I literally didn't understand. And then I realized belatedly that I was the last person to have heard the news. And I described my reaction that day as stunned, because it was stunning. I mean, it was an extraordinary thing, for a member of the British royal family to be arrested. We do not do that. We're not that kind of country. The last time we tried it was King Charles I, I think, and he lost his head, and that was the end, briefly, of the monarchy. So it was quite a moment, right? We do not have moments like that. And then as I sort of sat there, I thought, the weirdest thing about this was the other part of my head was saying, finally, right? I mean, sort of finally, because it's been nearly 7 years. And what was interesting, of course, was that he was arrested for misconduct in public office, a white-collar crime, with emails about sort of his role as a trade envoy. It had nothing to do with the allegations that had pursued him for the last 15 years.
It's like an Al Capone tax situation.
Yeah, and it was really interesting, because I talked to Skye Roberts, Virginia's brother, that day, and I said, what are we, how are we feeling about this? That you've been so hard at work to try and make Virginia's story get heard, and then it turns out to be the tax thing, it's the license plate, sort of, And I remember him kind of saying, actually, we want to see justice served, whatever that means, by whichever means. If this is the way that they can do it, they can do it. And don't forget, on the day he was arrested, there were actually, I think, 8 other police forces, all following different leads about slightly different things. There was one, looking at Essex police were looking at flights coming into Stansted, Bedfordshire police, flights coming into Luton, looking at the number of trafficked women that may have been part of the Epstein circle at that time. There was the Met Police, there was the Thames Valley Police. Sorry, this is very, very prosaic. You don't want to know every police force in the UK, but my point is just that this was the one that found enough evidence to go and make that arrest. I don't think it means that the other forces are not working in concert or simultaneously on the much bigger questions that are still at stake. So, yes, I mean, I was stunned, because we never see that. But I'd also say 6 years was a long time. They had a lot of time. They could have started those investigations earlier. They could have started them and not dropped them, And I think what King Charles did last September, October, when he removed the title from his brother and basically kicked him out of Windsor, was his way of saying, my hands are off now.
Surely the palace would have looked through the emails and that sort of thing. I mean, do you think that maybe the palace knew more before this happened?
I don't know what they saw, but I would be surprised if they didn't know that there was more to come out.
There was more, they must have.
But I think it was more symbolic than that. I think it was a way of saying, whatever happens after this, I am not going to stand in your way. And I was given intelligence sort of from behind the scenes about the conversation that Charles had with his brother in October, which was, you need to do this if we want the monarchy to continue. You need to relinquish that title and get out of this house if you want to see a stable monarchy. You know, it was almost like, let's not forget Mum, you know. I mean, maybe that wasn't the phrase he used precisely. But I think from what I learned, there was this sense of real pressure on Andrew to understand what was at stake in terms of Charles's own reign.
And the character of Andrew is just so fascinating. I mean, I watched that interview again recently. Absolute masterclass in restraint by you. And then on the other side, I mean, I don't think I've ever seen anything like it. I often say to people when I'm talking to institutions, you know, for Four Corners stories about them stumping up and doing an interview about something they don't really want to talk about, it's always better to do an interview. You will always look better than, you know, sending some anodyne statement and looking like you're running away and you've got something to hide, except if you're Prince Andrew. He is the caveat. And I'm so fascinated in his personality, like having myself done a lot of journalism about powerful men who commit sexual crimes. I don't know if you ever read David Copperfield by Dickens, but there's this character in it, Steerforth, and he says, ride on, rough shod if need be, smooth shod if that will do, but ride on over all obstacles and win the race. And I wonder, like, in your view, was Andrew a Steerforth, like one of those people who just kept winning and just pushing people aside, or is he just not very bright?
Yeah, I mean, my worry, genuinely, is that, he was the kid at the back of the race, actually. And the reason that he was sort of so open was because he didn't really have that sense of self. And as Amy knows very well, there are lots of other predators and rapists out there who are just whip smart, brilliant, manipulative, and will shut you down, will legally fight you down, and they, we are all scared to mention their names because we know the force of the law that they can manipulate. And I think, I do feel part of my brain thinks, that's where we should be focusing now. But I mean, to Andrew's personality, I think there was a moment when we were setting up the chairs, right? And it was in a ballroom, right? It was in his hood. It was in Buckingham Palace. And so I sort of came in and was thinking, oh gosh, I'm meant to be made to feel small. And I was, it was sort of the thrones, the chairs, the big room, this really kind of swirly big carpet. And I sort of sat down. And then the sound engineer comes over and he starts fixing my mic. And Andrew starts telling him what to do. And you're like,
telling
really?
the soundie what to do.
He's a sound engineer. Yeah. He does this every day. He's got this. He's okay. And Andrew, I think he was trying to be helpful, but he's like, what you want to do is run the cable out, just put it on the back and whip it out of there, and up you're much better. And I thought, there's a man who actually just looks at the world from a position of just assuming knowledge, assuming power, assuming sort of,
the fact he keeps using the royal we. He keeps talking about we.
But also it's this idea of honor, you know, and he said,
Oh, yes.
it was why didn't you end the relationship? I mean, that was a really easy question, I have to say. He had that one for 5, you know, why didn't you end the relationship earlier with Epstein? And he should have just said, big mistake.
Right.
But he doesn't.
Yeah.
He says, I thought it was the honorable thing to do, right?
To stay at the house for 4 days. Was it 4 days
Yeah.
he stayed at the house
Yeah.
after Epstein has been
But I
convicted?
think in his head that was how, you know, that was how he needed to portray himself. You know, in brackets, I'm a man of honor. I'm the king's favorite son. I'm in line to the throne. You're not going to fell me. And I think that that was part of his whole, you know, carcass. Do I mean that? Sort of carapace, almost. You know, that was what he wore. That was who he was. That was how he arrived into a room.
But he just
that was
kept getting it wrong, you know? I mean, there was the time when you asked him about the fact that he'd gone to a party during this stay after Epstein had been convicted while he was staying with him. And he says, oh, it wasn't a party. It was a small gathering. And I was like, mate, that's worse. Like, that means you're amongst an intimate gathering of people with the pedophile.
Do you know what? It was even funnier, Louise. I said it was a party in your honor. And he went, no. And then he went, well, I was there. Which meant anytime I'm there, it's in my honor because I'm a prince. It was a totally different way of recalibrating the world.
Oh,
and
so fascinating.
It comes from living in a gilded cage, being told that you have impunity, right? Being told that you have immunity from any of the outside world that might come to get you, being told that your mum can pay off, you know, anything awkward with, who knows, £12 million. We still don't know. He made a court case go away. He made Virginia's civil suit go away. He would have faced her in a civil trial 4 years ago this week, actually, on March the 10th. And yet somehow it was magicked away.
Yes, they're always going to defend their reputation and clear their name until they're not.
Right.
Until they walk away with nothing. You know, they don't stump up because it's too difficult. But
I just want to say one thing about the importance of Emily to Virginia. So it's in the book, but the interview happens, and it's, as you said, masterful. And he hangs himself, but only because you laid the groundwork. So it was amazing. And she's in the middle of preparing a suit against him for rape. In a civil suit, there was a look-back window in the state of New York. She was allowed to, because statutes of limitations say, oh, sorry, that happened too long ago. But they were allowing statutes of limitations to be waived for, it turned out, 2 years because of COVID. It was supposed to only be 1 year. And she's preparing that suit. And they're telling them, her lawyers are saying, we're going to sue your ass, so come to the table. And in the midst of that, your interview happens. And as we write about in the book, it is, I believe the words we use is, it is rocket fuel for that litigation. But another thing happens in the book. I mean, it brings him to the table and ultimately really makes him settle. There's no question that your work did that. There's another thing that happens at the end of the book. And by that point, Emily has written a book, and it has been made into a TV 3-part series. And I had watched it and loved particularly one scene in it. And I thought, I think we should put this in the book because it was a monologue of Emily talking about her own experience of being stalked by somebody who meant her harm. And she's reflecting on the Epstein victims and how they're forced over and over again, like you were in your own experience, the endless bloody talking about it. You have to repeat yourself and repeat yourself and repeat yourself. You have to open up a vein over and over again and talk about how much it hurt you. And when I watched that scene at home in California, I thought, that summarizes exactly, those words of Emily's exactly summarize what we've been writing this book about for 4 straight years. So right before the presidential election in 2024, I went to Perth again with a finished manuscript that pretty much finished manuscript, except for the scene, actually. And I said to Virginia, there's this dramatization of Emily's book. It's basically about the strategy and how they prepared and how they got the interview. And so I don't think it'll be triggering, but I want you to think about it. But I really like you. I can cue it up. I just want you to watch this one scene. And she was like, let's watch the whole thing. So we sat on the couch. I wrote about this in a New York Times op-ed. We sat on the couch in Perth, and we watched your show. And she was rapt by the whole thing. She hung on every word. And then I said, you see that one part? Like, that's the thing you've been saying to me over and over again. And here's how I want to use it. I think we can use that. And I went and wrote it, and I came back and I read it to her. And she felt seen by you. And that's why it's in the book. And you deserve credit for that.
Well, thank you. I think it was Amy who taught me something, which was, once the book comes out and once, we understand once the file's there and once the names are there, we as journalists are all sort of saying, well, isn't it great? Where are the survivors now? Like, where are they now? Aren't they coming forward? Aren't they kind of picking up the investigations? And you just said it's not their job anymore, right? That they have, and this is something I keep going back to in my head, that some of those young women, kids, frankly, gave their testimony in 2005 and 6, right? They've told their stories. They gave their stories to the FBI, to the West Palm Beach police. They told everyone what happened. And it's kind of not on them now to have to retell and relitigate and re-remember and recount, because we're sort of sitting here going, oh, where are you now? We're ready. We now understand it. We've got the Epstein Files. And I think you made that point really early on to me, that actually it's trauma and it's the recounting, but actually also they still fear for their lives. And I think that's a whole different place we have to get our heads into, that, on a good day, you're kind of going, isn't it amazing? Here are the Epstein Files. It's all out there. We can do this. We know where to look now. We know what our next year's work is going to be. And they're thinking, fuck's sake, you've just put my whole life in danger again. You've just upended everything that I had kind of put away or tucked away.
And it's not all out there, because half the files are not there, and they've omitted, as we're all following, key parts of the files. Right. And they have redacted the names of the perpetrators or potential perpetrators, and they have unredacted some of the names of the victims, thus putting their lives, no joke, in danger. Yeah.
Because it's not just about Epstein, it's about a whole lot of other people as well who are powerful.
Raft of men, and some women, but mostly men.
On the victims, I did want to sort of unpack this, because one of the things that's really, really powerful in the book is how Virginia was a victim of her own father and another man as a small child. And then again, she was raped as a teenager. And it's fascinating to me, so often when I've done, stories about people who were victims of clergy abuse, almost all of them have had a previous abuser. It's this sort of, but then when they come forward to tell their story, it's like, oh, well, come on, you couldn't have had this happen to you so many times. It's just not plausible. And is that something that was painful for Virginia? Like, just the fact that there's that lack of belief, and there's the kind of, I think you said before, slut shaming about that?
Well, it's almost like, because this has happened to you so many times, you must be a slut. Like, you must have put yourself, it's the old thing with rape accusations, like you must have dressed wrong, you must have put yourself on the wrong, you must have had one too many glasses of wine. It's your fault, it's your fault. And especially to say that to somebody who was victimized as a child repeatedly is horrifying. But yeah, I mean, remember, for Virginia and for all the survivors, they have not been believed. Annie Farmer and Maria Farmer, sisters, they made their allegations in 1996. That's how long the Epstein Files go back to. So it's not just the investigation in 2005 that ends up in the plea deal, which gives Epstein a prison sentence that allows him to leave the prison every day and go to an office where he abuses teenagers some more. That was his prison sentence. So you know, there have been people coming forward over and over and over, and until the past year, these women have not been listened to. And so, I mean, again, I think that's something for us all to remember to be outraged by. And there's only a small group of them that are public. So those people are, you know, you may see them at a press conference at Capitol Hill in the United States, gathering on the steps of the Capitol. But don't think to yourself, oh, that's all the victims. Like, there are at least 1,000 and maybe more Eastern European women, Russian women, women who were threatened, women who were, you know, completely trafficked in the sense that you think of, you know, flown into different countries and didn't even know the language. So they had not just no money, but kind of no way to escape.
There's a concept that we have in Australia, I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but crumb maidens. It was coined by Amy Maitlis, who's a journalist here, and it's basically women politicians who do men's dirty work for the crumbs. And I wondered about Ghislaine Maxwell. You know, is she a crumb maiden, or is she something far more sinister? You know, you must have got inside the head of Ghislaine Maxwell through this process. What do you think of her?
Well, I know Virginia felt that they were two halves of an evil whole. They were symbiotic. She had the connections. She connected him to Prince Andrew, for example. She was great at a party. She was a mingler. She was a connector. She was fun. And he had the money. And so that was part of Virginia's take on it. But in addition, Virginia felt that Ghislaine was far more evil than Giuffre.
I mean, I think she calls her an apex predator.
Apex predator, for sure. Because remember, again, this is not a woman who just kept the date book or who recruited but then went away. She had sex with the girls. She forced them to sexually service her. If she was angry at them, she used a variety of sex tools to hurt them during sex. I mean, this is not somebody who just had a crush on Epstein and wanted to make him happy and, okay, you can have sex with teenagers, but please love me. That's not, no. That wasn't, maybe that was part of it. Maybe that was part of it in the beginning, but she was fully involved in the predation. That is why she was convicted. She's a convicted sex trafficker. It's almost like I feel like I have to keep repeating that as you see these calls for pardons and her brother going, you know, writing pieces in The Spectator saying, you know, this is an outrage and she's been made a scapegoat and isn't it anti-feminist even? He's almost arguing that a woman is in prison. It's terrible for all these men's, but she was part of the predation, and frankly, it wouldn't have happened. Virginia's a perfect example. She went with her because she was female. And another issue that we talked about the other night, class. So she was posh. And that made a lot of these girls who were poor go, well, I can totally trust her. Like, her handbag, as Virginia writes in the book, her handbag is worth more than my father's truck. So this is a fancy person, and she seems to be taking me seriously. This is part of the lure. This is part of the predator's playbook. You make people feel like they matter because you are so much more important than them, and you're paying attention to them.
So, and on another point, and I think this is a really interesting and thorny question, and it's probably something that you grappled with as well, Emily, is that Virginia herself was actually recruiting these girls. And
they all were. It was a pyramid scheme.
It was a pyramid scheme. And that is actually part of the victimhood, because you entrap by making them somehow complicit.
They're complicit. That's the trick. Is not only do they bring you new, fresh meat Sorry, but that's what it was. But now they're guilty too. So it makes it harder for them to pull, to call the authorities. It makes it harder for them to escape. I mean, I'm sure you've thought about it as well.
Yeah, I wondered, Emily, did you know about that aspect of it when you were doing the work that you were doing with?
Yeah, and look, it is really problematic because you have to start from scratch, right? You have to start from scratch and say, well, the recruiting was, as Amy describes it, part of what she was sent out to do, right? And we were talking about this earlier, a lot of people were kind of like, well, why wouldn't you run away? Or why wouldn't you complain at the time? And I don't know if there's a word for it even, that the sense of being in the middle of something that has kind of overwhelmed you to the point where you don't understand the effect that the abuse is having on you, to the extent where yes, of course she could have left, except her brother was threatened, except she found, police cars in her driveway, sort of pointing at her, except she had the phone call saying, if you talk about it, don't forget that you're implicated in this. And I think the statute of limitations thing is so interesting. I think that's the difference with the UK. I think we don't have a statute of limitations on sex crime.
We don't in Australia either, yeah.
But America does, which is why it was all to do with where the courts were hearing this stuff. And I cannot get myself, my own head in the place where you don't even realize what is happening to you because you've internalized the blame to the point where you think it's all your fault.
It's an invisible prison. It's interesting. So I've got a book out at the moment, a novel, and it's about a cult that was sort of at the fringes of the Catholic Church. And this actually did happen. And it's a big legal case at the moment. But all of these women were forced to be celibate, to work all hours of the day for no money. They had no keys to the house. They had no agency. They wore hand-me-down clothes. They ate leftovers and that sort of thing. And, people keep saying to the survivors again, why didn't you run? Why didn't you go away? But they are so groomed into it, and subtle threats. And also, in this case as well, it was women who were doing the recruiting.
I think Amy describes at one point how when she's in the Louvre, she's standing in Paris with Epstein and Maxwell, and for a moment she kind of like, the guards or the people around the tourists think that she's their daughter, and she's almost looking to them as their. She's had a pretty shit childhood, right? She was.
Well, and they would take her to a boat show and they would say, we're going to pretend we're your parents.
Right.
So it was like it was a thing. And she didn't have a great home life, and she had a lot of things she wished for. And I think that's another key part of the grooming, which we've kind of talked around, but
you get the vulnerable.
More than the $200 per sexual event. The thing that kept Virginia, and she describes this really well in the book, in there, and it was true for, I think, a lot of the young women, chosen for their vulnerability, chosen for the fact that they were desperate in one way or another, was that these posh people, or geniuses in the case of Epstein, were saying, we see something in you. You're special. We could help you become somebody who matters, basically. And it was that which, for Virginia, and I think for many other survivors, she hadn't heard that enough in her life. In a good family, in a family with parents that are supportive, they're saying, you could be president someday, you can do anything you want, you set your mind to. That was not Virginia's experience. And so it was to be told she had potential, to be told she was smart, to be told she would make a great mother someday, which there's a scene in the book where they lay that on thick and then ask her to bear their child for them. That was part of what was keeping them in the loop.
So I'm just going to go to some of the questions from Slido from the audience. I'll ask both of you this. First of all, Emily, do you think that we'll see any of the male perpetrators be arrested or convicted from the files? I mean, Prince Andrew's obviously been arrested, but some of the others, and B, do you think that's going to go anywhere?
Yes, I do. Actually, yes, I do, because if we go out there not believing that anything is going to happen as a result of the Epstein Files, then what are we all doing, right? What am I doing as a journalist? What is Amy's work about? We can't be complicit in saying, oh no, nothing's going to happen. So if we start by saying, and I think this is important, if there is a presumption that something will happen, we will make it happen. And I'm not saying, I'm saying it has to be through justice. I'm not saying go out and shoot everyone. It has to be through a process, but seriously, not sort of vigilantism. I want to see due process. I want to see the courts brought in. I want to see the police investigations. But I will go out and say, I do believe that this will bring good. I do believe that this will result in something. Otherwise, what's the point?
There's another question that I think is really interesting about NDAs and how they played a major role in covering up the abuse in the Epstein Files and in every big abuse case. I mean, my personal view is that NDAs should be banned in sexual cases. But what was the impact in this example of NDAs?
Well, certainly Virginia, she settled for $500,000 with Epstein years ago, and she was sworn to secrecy. There were a lot of women who had settlements. Those documents then later came out in various court records, so we all know how much it was and when it happened and all of that. But I think there's thousands of women who made settlements.
Can I just say that when I'm not sort of thinking about Andrew, the interview that my head keeps going back to was one that I did with Harvey Weinstein's personal assistant, and her name is Zelda Perkins. And Zelda Perkins witnessed the attempted rape of her colleague at the hands of Harvey Weinstein, and when she went to tell his company, they slapped an NDA on her and the victim, and they wouldn't even let her touch the NDA. She wasn't allowed to be in the same room as the NDA. She wasn't allowed to talk about the NDA. And as a result, she was silent about it for 27 years. And she finally broke her NDA to me on Newsnight. And I remember that interview because it was so long. It was the first time she'd started to speak, and she didn't stop. This is what happens when you say, you are now going to go out there and tell us what actually happened. It was an extraordinary conversation, and she has now made it her life's work to change the law in the UK so that you cannot use an NDA to cover up criminal behaviour. And she has pushed that through the legislation. She's doing it in the US now too. Yeah. So, there is work being done on this.
It's such a re-traumatizing thing to do to someone because
you monetize silence. That's what you're doing. You're buying somebody's silence.
Well, but also that silence is perhaps the most corrosive thing for victims. I think eventually they almost always get to a point where they need to speak about it. What do you think is the implication for the world and women today, given the horrendous content of these files has been released with so little repercussions so far? I mean, we've got Ghislaine Maxwell in jail, potentially being pardoned by Donald Trump. We've got Andrew being arrested for, Al Capone tax reasons. And what else have we got? This is horrific.
Well, I share Emily's optimism. I think my understanding of they got Andrew on what they had in the emails. They had him kind of dead to rights. They had him. So they arrested him on that. But my sense has been that they are using that as a jumping off point. I think I'm hopeful that there will be other charges. We'll just leave it at that. But what's happening in the United States is an outrage. I mean, Norway, France, Poland, there are a lot of investigations going on into what role did our institutions play in this horrifying sex trafficking ring that involved institutions, powerful people, elites. People are aiming, the state of New Mexico is looking into it, but our federal government in the United States is not, and is basically saying again and again, we're not gonna make any prosecutions. I mean, nothing to see here. We're all watching this set of documents that allege that President Trump raped a 14-year-old girl that were not in the files, and then people figured that out, and now they've released a couple of those reports. And, I don't know the veracity, I don't know that woman, but clearly, and the Miami Herald actually has a source from the Department of Justice saying, the FBI investigators, the DOJ investigators who interviewed this woman 4 times found her credible. And basically, the White House is saying, nuh-uh, she was crazy. She was inaccurate, she's nuts. So I want to feel like Emily, that we're gonna get them. But I'm not sure, again, that's why I go back to do not underestimate the power of your own outrage, because that's the only way it's gonna happen, is if people call their congressman in the United States every day and say, this is an outrage, this is an outrage. Make it hard for the Republican congressmen who are siding with Trump at the moment to keep doing that. I mean, it's gonna take a lot of people, individual people, speaking out about it.
On that note, what would you say, Emily, what would you ask Donald Trump if you had him in a Prince Andrew-style situation? But do you think it would make any difference, given his sort of post-truth type vibe?
Look, it honestly doesn't matter what you ask Donald Trump. It just doesn't matter. He'll turn around and tell me to shut up, Piggy. We know what's coming.
He call you Piggy.
But the point is, actually, I mean, Trump's gone around saying how exonerated he is. Like, he uses the word like he learnt it last week, and he's really fond of it, and he's going to get the T-shirt soon, and he just keeps repeating it. Yeah. I think we're at a point now where, and it is extraordinary to say this, but the words of the President of the United States are almost immaterial. What matters is how other people respond to him. So what matters is what we hear, what his party hears, what Congress does. Like, does he horrify them? I have to say, has anyone heard from J.D. Vance this week? Hello, we can't hear you, VP. Where is he? He doesn't like what the boss is doing. He's nowhere around, right? So I would just say that is what you're looking for. You're looking at how people respond to him now. Because if we're not careful, we start filling in the gaps of what we think he'd like, or what we think would make him happy, or what deal we think would get us over the line, or how we get our best trade. I mean, it turns out if none of us had done any trade tariff deals, we'd all be better off now, right? Frankly.
Just quickly on that point, because we're about to end, but
Sorry.
Do you think that the war in Iran is a distraction from the creepy pedophile stuff?
Absolutely. I mean, that it's trying to change the subject. It's trying to get, in Trump's words, all of the people to move on from the Epstein Files. Nobody's interested anymore.
Pretty extreme dead cat.
And I think the one thing I will try to be hopeful about is this idea that sometimes the cover-up is worse than the crime, and sometimes the cover-up is what gets the guys. And that's what's going on now, is, Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, has been subpoenaed and is going to have to testify in front of the House Oversight Committee. That's a huge thing that happened. And she's gonna have to answer for the fact that they bungled it. They didn't release all of it. They released it in a way that endangered victims and protected perpetrators. And people are probably more Democrat than Republican will be grilling her on that. And I think that's the beginning of a potential, opening up of this cover-up, which could be maybe sort of like an Al Capone tax, getting them on that instead of on the crimes. But I'm hopeful that that has power and that ends up in something that really rights a wrong.
Well, let's end on a hopeful note and let's keep talking about this. I think the only way that these crimes, I think it's wrong to think that they're ever going to stop, but they might be harder to commit if we all keep talking about it. So thank you so much for your wonderful work.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And thank you so much to all of you for coming. And there will be book signings afterwards. And as I always say, it's a legal requirement that you buy our books. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.